name's Andy Tidy and welcome to another edition of Life at 2.3 miles an hour. In my last episode, I started to review the service routine on our Beta 38 engine. Now, I was wildly optimistic about what I could actually get into a single video. So the last video just concentrated on the essential, which was the engine lubrication routine. In this episode, I'm going to follow through on the rest of my winter maintenance program on the engine. So, hope you enjoy this episode. Hope you get a few insights into what I do. Feel free to comment, give some top tips on how I could improve my regime. So, hope you enjoy the episode and I'll see you at the far end.
Now, while we're servicing the boat, I always have a look at the air filter. It's a simple pancake filter that comes off with 3 clips, and the top pops off like that, and here's the air filter. Now, it's only run for about a third of the time it would normally run for, and you can see that the section next to the air intake has got itself is the dirtiest bit, but generally speaking that's a pretty clean air filter. So all we need to do is to pop that one back in. That's good for another probably 500 hours. It depends a little bit on the nature of where I'm cruising and if there's much dust and dirt flying around. And whilst we're in here, I mentioned the fuel filter. This one is the fuel filter. It spins on and off, comes off full of diesel, spin a new one on, and then you pump this little button up and down, and that primes it up and fills up the pipes all the way to the injectors with diesel oil. And I do that every 750 hours, which in effect is normally once a year. And that brings us on to the last oil change, which is the gearbox change. The gearbox is a PRM 125. Originally this engine was mated with a PRM 120 which lasted for about 15 years, and then 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, I had to have a new one put on, and the PRM 125 is a slightly updated version of the PRM 120. It's got a fascinating system inside where there is a lever and 2 cones, and as you put it into forward and backwards, the cones mesh into a male and female, and that's what gives you a clutched drive. Now, I used to be a little bit cavalier about my maintenance of my gearbox. I always figured that providing the fluid inside it was cherry red and it stayed that way, then the gearbox must all be just fine. Sadly, in the end, the gearbox died and I had to put a new one in, and PRM Newage, their instructions make it very clear that for this gearbox you should not use engine oil, but you should use automatic transmission fluid suitable for Drexon 3, which is the automatic transmission fluid standard, and you should change it every time you change your engine oil. So that's what we're going to do. Now, it's a little bit challenging to show you an oil change on the gearbox, but you need to know about the 3 openings. There is a dipstick and filler point here on the top. Around on the side you've got the overflow, which is the maximum fill level, and then down around underneath you've got a sump plug, just like you would have on an old-fashioned car, or to that matter a modern car. So what we need to do is to open up all 3, drop out the old gearbox oil and replace it with new until it dribbles out of this filler level hole. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to start by undoing the sump plug, dropping it into a container at the bottom, and then we'll see what the condition looks like. So we'll take out the dipstick and the filler hole. And it's really hard to see the higher and lower levels. Next we need to crack off the overflow plug, which is just down here at the side. Nothing should overflow at this point. Just keep it safe, put it to one side, don't lose the O-ring. Now the third and the final opening is the drain plug, which is here underneath the gear selector. So I can just about see it. I'm not sure I can get the camera to it. Right, that just needed cracking off with a spanner. And this is the nut down here. So I'm just going to undo that by hand now. And hopefully the gear oil will flow down into my bucket.
Now this is the sump plug, which is magnetised, and what that means is that it can pick up any magnetic sludge. So what I got on my finger here at the end, it contains ferrous metal. Now there's nothing much in there, but there is just a fine film of ferrous metal from within the gearbox. You can tell the wear on it. Now when I first got it, it was picking up a lot of bits of filings and things from its manufacture. These days just the smallest bits but this is why you change your oil. You need to change the oil in order to take these impurities out of the system and replace it with clean, so that you don't mess up your clutch plates. So this is the old used gearbox oil that's come out, and it's been running around in there for about 250 hours. I think you can probably see that it still looks fairly cherry red, although there's a certain opaqueness to it. But possibly if you thin it out and put a bit on the paper like this, you can see that actually it's still clean and clear and probably fit for purpose. But in any case, because I found those ferrous filings on the magnetic sump plug, it definitely needs changing, and for the sake of about £3 every time you change the engine oil, why not? And because I change my transmission fluid every 250 hours, I keep a bit of a stock in. As you can see, I've got Rexon D3, which was one I'm using. D2 is also fine for this gearbox, and I'll keep that one for another day. Now while we're doing the oily parts of the engine, it makes sense to refill the stern gland greaser. This is a brass tube which you wind this handle down every time you move the boat, and it squirts grease down through this tube all the way into the stern gear. It lubricates and it helps seal it to stop water getting in. So let's get the greaser off and repacked with grease. Now one thing which has cropped up during the latter part of this season has been a gradual accumulation in the amount of water dripping in from underneath the stern gland. It's not big enough to be a worry, and it stops when I put the grease in. And in fact, I just put the grease into the stern gland, and you can see there's a bit of black grease coming out at the end. So it's all watertight now, but when it runs, it drips a little bit. And what that tells me is that I need to tighten up the stern gland packing. And basically that means that in this brass section here, there are some coils of like tarry rope, and this shoves down against the tarry rope, creates a seal and stops the water coming in. Now, I thought you might be interested to see what that tarry rope looks like, and it's this stuff. It's kind of square in profile. You wind it around the prop shaft like this. You cut it into, say, 3 discs, and then you pack it in and ram it in. Now it's important that you get the right size of stuffing to go in the box. The last lot that was in my box was too small, and it meant no matter how much I tightened it, the prop shaft would just keep leaking. Anyway, I got the bigger size, which is then a bit too big, but I just hammered it down a little bit because it flattens out, got it to the right size, tucked it in, and never really been a problem since. But a couple of times a year I just need to do half a turn on the nuts
just to tighten them up and get another seal again. So seeing as it's going to be sitting here for the winter, I'm going to do just that. So what we have to do is to slacken off the retaining nuts. And for this I use 2 spanners. So what I need to do is to use 2 spanners, one on the back one to hold it tight, one on the front one. Turn them against each other like this, and as you'll see, I can now release the locking nut at the front. And we'll do the same process with the other side. So what we now have is the stern gland running free against these 2 they're like bolts that bolt into the they're called studs, but they go into the stern gear. So what we need to do is to give these first ones half a turn. Now don't do it up too much, because if you do, all you do is over tighten it, cause the stuffing to bind up inside the stuffing box, and the whole thing will overheat. So literally I've done maybe half a turn on each one. That will be just enough to squeeze it up tight and just to pack it in tight and to recreate a good watertight seal. And once I've finished with doing that, it's exactly the reverse of unlocking them. You hold the one lock in place and you just tighten up the one behind it against it, and that creates a locking nut so that they can't rattle loose as you're cruising around. So that's the stuffing box tightened up, re-greased, full batch of stern gear grease as well. Right, while I'm here at the back end of the boat, it makes sense to give a bit of a winter check of the weed hatch. Now, we're blessed on this boat to have a very accessible weed hatch. I know some people have to crawl in underneath their engine counters and undo bolts. This one is as quick as you like. But what I'm checking for is to make sure that the seals around the weed hatch are intact and they're holding the water back. I've known, even on this boat, to have my dipstick fall down across the back and have the weed hatch rest on it and water spurting out and getting inside the engine bay. And I had a couple of inches accumulate that way, so it's very easy to do. This one is fine. If it's not fine, you just need some more of this tape, which is self-adhesive and sticks on like that. Costs a matter of a few quid, just keeps it safe. Anyhow, that weed hatch seal is just fine. Now I'm going to reach down and I'm going to make sure that the propeller turns freely, and that will tell me if I've overdone the packing. Well, it feels stiffer than it did, but it runs easily, so that's all right. You might notice my emergency prop clearing mechanisms. On the BCN there's a lot of rubbish in the canal, so these are 2 forms of bolt cutters or wire cutters. This one, an old kitchen knife, is great for bits of rope. This one, a garden saw that cuts on the backstroke, is perfect for cutting heavy weed and bits of sari and stuff like that. So they always live next door to the weed hatch, and if I'm doing this job in the winter months when the water's gone cold, I tie a bit of string around the kit and I tie it onto the side of the weed hatch so that if I lose it, I can retrieve my tools and continue the task when my fingers are not so numb. So anyhow, that's good. There is one other filter that does need to have a look. I need to look at, and that's the water separator in the fuel system. That's this aluminium chamber here, and basically the fuel flows into it. Water, being heavier than fuel, if there is any, will drop down to the bottom, and the clear fuel will continue on. So once in a while it makes sense just to open up the bottom of this. It's got a wing nut on it on this particular one, and just check to see what's coming through. And having undone the wing nut, it's very clear that what I've got is pure diesel, so there isn't any water collecting in the water trap, and in fact I never have had any diesel contaminated with water on this one, but it's worth checking once in a while. Now, one important task to fulfill on a servicing the boat is to make sure you look after your batteries. You depend massively on these things, and it's very easy to forget them. They're out of sight, out of mind, but if you care for them, they'll take care of you for a very long time. This particular boat is fitted with 4 Trojan batteries, which are very long lasting, but they're not maintenance free. It's also got a cranking battery for the starting motor. The red ones in this battery bank are the 4 Trojan batteries. So battery 1, 2, 3 and 4. Now it's important to keep the batteries filled up with distilled water, and that goes in through these little holes at the top. Now I always find the challenge with these batteries is being able to see inside them clearly enough to know how much water to put in. Now I can see just on this one here that the water level is over the top of the lead plates. So it needs filling up a bit, but not a lot. My guess is this needs probably about 100 mils, but that's not very scientific. So what I tend to do is to pour it in and listen to it. And as the water note rises, it means it's coming up to the top of the cell. You don't want to put in too much, because if you do, you could cause the battery to boil as it recharges. But you don't want it too low, because it will destroy the lead cells, and that's very expensive. So a little bit each season before winter, really good idea. So between the 4 leisure batteries, they've taken on board about 2 litres of distilled water. They're a little bit tricky to get at those tops, but as I say, I just listen to the water trickling in, and once I've heard the note it makes with one that I can see coming up to full, I just listen to all the others as they trickle in, and it means that the cells are all well and truly flooded with acid to keep them safe over the coming winter. By contrast, this cell at the end, which is a couple of years old, which is the starting motor battery, that is a sealed cell, and I can't service it and I can't put anything in. You may wonder a little bit about the arrangement of the power leads coming in, and basically they are strapped up in what I believe to be the about the optimum way of spreading the load. So you've got your power lead coming off here, and then snaking across to the battery at the left, and then across to the right. It's 2 batteries and then 1 back, and by doing the same approach on the negative side, you try to balance out the flow of power going into the batteries, so that you don't constantly charge and discharge one battery, but instead you balance it out over the entire battery bank. The big saving grace for this particular set of batteries, which have now served me for 3 seasons and have it's not suffering any noticeable loss of effectiveness, is this wire coming in here. This is the power supply coming in from the solar panels. It comes in through an MPPT controller, and that just trickles in enough amps to keep the batteries at 100% all through the winter, and even on bad winter days it still gets enough power to keep the batteries fully charged. So that, as they say, is it. That's the motorboat serviced for another service interval, and it's the last time it'll be out running until we get through to the spring of 2021. Hope you enjoyed this whistle-stop tour through my service regime.
If you've got any observations and you think there are things that I'm doing wrong, please let me know. I've just picked this up as I've gone along, and as I say, the engine has run along happily now for 7,000 hours under my care, and I guess I'm doing something right. But if you only remember one thing, keep the lubrication regime going really regularly, and you'll keep the engine going for ages. Anyhow, hope you enjoyed this episode. I'll see you soon. Cheerio.